Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Micha, and today I have the privilege of just spending some time with Sosa and just sharing my story and putting it out there for you. So I'm just excited to do that. I'm going to just start way back. I grew up in a closed Christian commune, but it started some 50, 60, 70 years before that. And the reason I want to share some of these stories about it was my great Uncle Joe and my great grandfather. He was the one who started this commune, and they just have really neat stories. And so I just wanted to put that out there as well, just to explain a little bit more of the background and the history. And then great Uncle Joe, he grew up, it would have been the 1920s or 1910, 1920s. And during this, go back to great Uncle Joe, he, during the Second World War, he and his wife were aiding and abetting Jews during Hitler's regime, and when they were trying to wipe out the Jews. Him and his wife were actively involved in hiding and in helping these people get to freedom, get to free countries and things like that. And they were devout Catholics. They loved and feared God. And I am blessed to know some of these stories because when they were, I believe they were in their 80s or almost 90 when they finally came to Canada, and my dad was a teenager, and he remembers hearing all these stories of how they just experienced God's faithfulness as they just stepped out and took risk, just to honor these humans that were being, we all know what was happening to them. And so a couple of the stories that he remembers. So the first story that my dad can recall is during the war that Hitlers are doing whatever they can to exterminate the Jews. There was a high Jewish population in the city that my great Uncle Joe lived. And they had basically hatched up this scheme where they were going to come and drop these gas bombs on the city. And so they had sent out like leaflets in advance to all of the non-Jewish residents of that city, and had told them, on such and such a night, we're going to have you all go into the forest overnight, and just don't be in the city because we're going to come that night, drop these bombs. And the Jews obviously weren't informed of this, and so they're all going to be killed. And then whatever, in a couple of days, you all can come back into your homes and stuff and carry on life. And my great Uncle Joe and his wife, they just determined in their hearts that like, if the Jews were going to die, they were going to die with them. They weren't willing to go along with that plan. And so fast forward, that specific night came along, all the non-Jewish residents of the city had left, and they were basically camping in the forest for a couple of nights. And obviously all the Jews were in the city because they didn't know what was happening. And my great Uncle Joe and his wife, that night they just prayed. They stayed in their home with everybody, with all the Jewish residents. And what happened that night, for whatever reason, when the airplanes came to drop the bombs, they got the coordinates wrong, or something went awry, and they wound up dropping their bombs in the forest, like adjacent to the city instead of the city. And so that night their lives were spared along with all of the Jews in the city, and many of the people that had fled wound up getting impacted by that. And so that was the one story he remembers. Another one was towards the end of the war, great Uncle Joe and his wife and their little baby now, they were arrested and put on a train and sent to a concentration camp. And so what would happen at these camps is they'd get off the train, and then there'd be like these lines, and they would separate the people, and the men would go one direction, the women and kids another. And when it came to their turn, the guard there said, like, we're going to split your family. But I'll just call him Uncle Joe. He just simply refused. I'm not leaving my wife and my baby. Like, I don't care if you shoot me now. Like, I'm not going to be separated. And so this guard turned his back to talk to his superior. And in that moment, he just was like, okay, let's run. And so they actually were able to take off and crawl underneath the train. And on the other side of the train, there was a steep embankment that they were able to, I guess, go tumbling down and hide in a forest. And then they spent like 3 weeks walking through the forest back to their hometown. And so their lives were spared again. And then another time at the end of the war was over, and they were wanting to leave the country. and they were going through the process of getting all the paperwork. It was a communist country, so it was very difficult to travel and to leave. It was almost impossible to leave the country. And so they had all their paperwork lined up except for one piece of information, and he had an address that he was going to get this one final stamp so he can leave the country and then come back again. And he couldn't find this address for whatever reason. And he met an elderly gentleman on the street and was like, hey, like, I have this address. I'm trying to find this office. I need this stamp. He's like, can you point me in the right direction? And this elderly gentleman said, whatever you do, don't go there. People that go into that office, they don't come out alive. He's like, just go back to your home and never come back here. And so it was a third time that his life was spared. And so I just love these stories of great-great-uncle Joe and their faithfulness and the way they saw God's mercy and his miracles move in a time where they were intentionally stepping out and just defying the regime and the law of evil. So that's, great-great-uncle Joe's, some of his stories and testimonies. I'm so grateful for him and for his life. And those are stories I hold dear because just think it matters. And I have a heart for justice as well. And I really feel like that plays into that. And then, so now switching gears a little bit. So my great-great-grandfather, so that would be the brother of great-great-uncle Joe. So he has a little bit of a different story, but he was, and now rewind, he's in the army in the First World War. And he's not a Christian. His family was Catholic, but he had rejected that because there were some family members who were religious, but doing some very shady things. And so he had just rejected religion altogether. And he's in the First World War fighting. And there was one night where there was heavy artillery and almost all of his battalion got killed overnight. And it was him and two other guys that had survived. And actually during this time in the trenches, somebody had given him a New Testament. So just to back up a little bit, a fellow soldier had given him a New Testament. He was reading this New Testament, and that's how when he got born again and he got saved. And then this night happens where everybody gets killed in the trenches, and he's like, I'm done. He just couldn't handle it anymore. So he just defected from the army and found his way back to his parents' place and wound up digging a hole under the pig pen. So for months he was living in this hole under the pig pen, and the entrance to that hole was right under the slop bucket where the pigs would eat. And obviously that being intentional, so people wouldn't be looking for him there. And so and then the army started coming every day to his parents' door and knocking on the door and being like, hey, they were just demanding information about their son and his whereabouts. And one day after several months of this, he's hiding every day, coming out at night to shower, eat, all that. His parents told him, hey, the military was here today. They said they're going to come next time and burn down our house and our barn if you don't reveal to us the whereabouts of your son. And so that night he packed up a couple of things in a bag, and he didn't want to put his parents in danger like that. And so he just left. He literally left through the forest at night, and he never saw them again. So he's fleeing from the army. It's the middle of the First World War, so crossing borders is super dangerous. He got picked up trying to cross from, I forget which border it was, but he got picked up at the border and put in jail. So he's sitting in jail because he's just super suspicious. He's trying to leave the country without papers in the middle of a war, and so that they didn't buy his story. And so he's in jail, but he was an engineer. He's a really smart guy, and one of the higher ups at the jail came to him, and he knew that he was an engineer, and he's like, there's a big problem with pickpockets at that time, and so he's like, hey, if you can invent something that I can use on my wallet, so basically people can't steal my wallet, you'll be a free man. I'll let you go. And so he came up with some kind of device where he wrapped the wallet in copper and attached it to a battery and some little things like that. And then he had the officer come to him and try to steal the wallet from his pocket. And apparently when he grabbed the wallet, it gave him such a shock that his hand flew up and hit the officer. He hit himself in the nose and gave himself a bloody nose. And so it worked. And that officer upheld his promise, and he was a free man. So I believe he was in Austria at that point. And so anyway, so he starts traveling around Europe, actually, and he he was reading in the book of Acts, and it says that there's a couple of verses that speak to the believers lived communally, and nobody had any lack, because people with land and businesses would sell it and give to the people who didn't have things. And so he basically, out of these couple of verses, came up with this idea of finding a group of like-minded people who would live in community and share everything. And basically, it would be this utopia that would be everybody would just take care of each other, and that people could live just more effectively that way and simply. And so he just had this wild story. Most people just thought he was ridiculous and crazy, and so he just traveled around and was working in different places, and eventually he wound up in England. He said the church in England that he connected with said, "What's a great idea, but we need a whole bunch of money. So if you go to America, money grows in trees in America," is what they believed. And so he goes over to America. It's in the Great Depression in the 30s in America. And so he can't find a job. He's there 3 months. He's about to get kicked out. And then he crosses in Windsor, he walked across that famous Ambassador Bridge, I believe it was. And he found out that Henry Ford was hiring. So he started working for Henry Ford. That was his first boss in Canada. And so, yeah, so anyway, so he's just working and kind of starting to build a life a little bit. And this dream though never dies inside of him, where he's like, man, I want to find like-minded people, and we're going to start this thing and all work together and live in harmony, and it's going to be beautiful. And he starts approaching churches. He found a Nazarene church there in Windsor, and they said you're crazy, like terrible idea. And they're like, you should go out west, talk to the Nazarene bishop, and he'll set you straight, and he'll explain to you why this is a terrible idea. And so he did that. He went to Alberta, or maybe Manitoba. I'm not actually quite sure right now. But he met up with the Nazarene bishop and started spending some time there, and wound up falling in love with the bishop's daughter. And she believed in his vision, and they got married, and the bishop did not. But so now he's married. There's 2 of them, and they met another couple, and then I think 1 or 2 single people. And they formed this little band of farmers. They started farming, and they started this small Christian, all the way back now to this little Christian commune where everybody lived together, worked together, shared everything. And it started out with, I believe it was 6 or 7 of them. And this would have been around in the 40s at some point. And so over the decades, that just started to grow. They moved to Ontario. They migrated to Ontario, and along the way, people just started joining. And so, yeah, my grandfather was born and raised in that. My dad was born and raised in that. And then I was born and raised in that as well. And so I grew to about 120 people when I was there. And so it was this kind of almost like self-sustaining little group of people that did church together. We had our own school, our own businesses. And honestly, for them, grew almost all of our own food. And it was this little bubble. We grew up on a farm on a dirt road, and it was closed off, so we didn't have friends outside of the commune. We weren't allowed to work outside of the commune, or or listen to the radio, or watch TV or anything like that. And so it was a very, very controlled environment. And so, so I came along. I'm growing up. This is all, like, when you're in a space like that, it's just really all you know. You don't actually know what life is like in any other kind of setting or in the world. We did have some exposure to it. Like if we would go shopping or things like that, we'd have to ask the elders for permission and sign up a car, and then you go do your shopping. So you would see the outside world, but it was just kind of this grip, this idea that they're bad, we're good. And there wasn't the freedom to explore or try new things, or you couldn't just leave. Like, that would be very much frowned upon. And you'd even be shunned, especially in my dad's generation. A number of my uncles left, and it was just very difficult for them, because they just lost all their community and family overnight. And so, so that's the culture that I grew up in. I know from here I'll jump into my own personal journey. Because I grew up in this culture that's very controlled, very rigid, very, very religious. There's rules for everything, like how often you go to church, how you do your hair, the clothes that you wear, who you hang out with, what you read. Like, there's just rules for every part of your life. And so that was all I knew. at the same time, like I don't remember a moment ever not that I ever didn't want to love God or follow him or serve him. Like from being a little child, I always had this heart for the Lord, but all I saw modeled was religion. And so I just embraced religion. So I was that like uber religious kid with a super sensitive conscience, and just, yeah, it was just religion. And so it was incredibly painful, incredibly difficult. So for a while that kind of worked, like into my teenage years. I got baptized when I was 16. And then towards the end of my teen years, I started to get, so the commune, so throughout my later teenage years, because the commune, the church of the commune, had this kind of mission, this vision to move to Israel and to serve the Jewish nation. And so actually throughout my teenage years, almost all of my friends and their families packed up, and they still live in Israel to this day as part of a church there. And so life got very small, very isolating. I got very lonely. And then as I started to get older, I was just wrestling with my faith, because I would read the Bible and learn about Jesus, and then I would see some of the decisions that were being made that just didn't line up with how I saw Jesus live his life. And so that was a point of just, it really disturbed me, because this faith that I believed I had, I believed we were these like really, special Christians, and I'm just not seeing the love of God being lived out practically. So 19, 20, 21. So those years got really, really hard, really lonely. I would say, like looking back, that I was depressed. And it got to a point where I was suicidal, and I was like, God, if you're real, I need you to show up. And if not, I'm done. Like, I can't do this. It's all just too confusing. It doesn't make sense. I'm not seeing you or experiencing you the way that I'm reading, like in the Bible. And so I just started like really wrestle with God, and is he even real? And if he is, does he care? Or is he just like distant and far away? And so there was one day particularly, I remember, it was in February, I believe February 2011. And I was working a job by myself, and I was just in tears. And I just remember thinking the pain, I just felt like you could break all the bones in my body, and that pain would be nothing compared to what I'm feeling emotionally. Wow. And in that place, I was just suicidal, and I'm like, God, you need to show up or I'm out. And so the next day, it was actually the very next day, within 24 hours, my sister had convinced me to go with her to a different church. And at that point, up until then, I would never do anything like that because it was breaking the rules. So I was just super like extreme rule follower, to a T, as much as I possibly could. And it was just destroying my life. And so then when my sister was like, hey, can you want to go to this church with me? Because she was getting really frustrated, and she was pretty much done as well with all of how we were living and the culture that we were in. And I was like, cool, whatever, I don't care anymore. I'll go with you to a different church. And so that was me rebelling. And anyways, so that Sunday morning we went to my church, and then we left a little bit early, and then we showed up at the other church kind of halfway through the sermon. And it was for the first time in my life, I was sitting in this other church, and I was feeling like people weren't looking at me and judging me. People accepted us. They talked to us, even though we did look a little different in the way we dressed. And I'm sure we were extremely socially awkward because we just did not interact with strangers. But I just felt embraced and accepted. And through a couple other things, God spoke so clearly to me that he was releasing me from this culture that I grew up in, because I believed up until that point, I had this conviction that I was supposed to stay with this culture and move to Israel and all of this. And God, so it was Saturday afternoon, I'm having suicidal thoughts, I'm super depressed, to the next day, God had totally released me from that, and everything changed. And so I started really getting involved at this new church. We did a book study on a book called Crazy Love by Francis Chan. And for the first time in my life, there's the first time in my life that I started to learn about God's heart for me and his love for me. And this had been a few months down the road now. But I had this moment where I could see myself on this day in February when I'm crying, I'm depressed and suicidal, and I'm crying to God. And I just had this picture as I'm reading this book and learning about God's heart for me. This picture started to form in my mind of just God as a father on his knees with tears in his eyes. And he was my brokenness and my pain was tearing him up way more than it was hurting even me. And he had been waiting for me all along just to come and be held by him in the middle of my pain and my brokenness. And that moment, like that's the defining moment of my life, when I knew that God loved me and embraced me and wanted to just hold me in my pain. And so from that moment on, it just set me on this whole completely different trajectory of just being like, oh my gosh, like I'm loved, God loves me, and I just want to know everything that I can about him, about who he is, and what it looks like to live in relationship with him. Because I think theology is really important. But for me, I'm like, I want something that's tangible, that's real. And if you have a theology that doesn't look like something that I can taste, touch, and see, then I don't really care that much about your theology. Like I want something that's real. So that just started to grow in me, this desire, this hunger to know God in a practical and a tangible way. So I'm still living in this same house with my family that are still part of the commune, but now I'm starting to, like, I'm going to a different church. I'm starting to like join a softball team, and I'm starting to interact with people outside of the commune. And I remember like, it was a difficult transition as far as just like, I remember being at a gas station for the first time in my life, at a public gas station. I'd never fueled up a car on a gas station outside of these little ones that we had at the commune. And I just remember being like freaked out and so insecure. And I'm like, oh my gosh, everybody's going to think I'm an idiot because I don't know how to fuel up a car in a public gas station. Wow. And so there was like a lot of moments like that, just figuring, going to like set up a bank account at 21. And the banker's like, how have you possibly not had a bank account before in your life? And he just didn't understand. It went over his head, and we didn't care to explain it because we were just as uncomfortable as he was, I think. So there's lots of little moments like that of just learning life in the real world and how to get insurance. So there's just this whole journey of figuring out how to like live life. But thankfully we had the safety net of we could still work at the commune, and our like housing was still paid for, so we could still live at home. And at the same time, we're like just starting to learn about the real world and how to actually exist and live life in the world. We have to pay rent and insurance and all that stuff. And in the meantime, like there's just this hunger for the Lord just kept growing in my heart. And I remember working in the machine shop, and then on my 15-minute breaks, like going home, and I just had this like desire to like read the Bible and spend time with God. And so there was a couple years there where I'm like, I had really deeply encountered God, and then I was in a pretty traditional church, and I was just serving as much as I could and getting involved in anything that I could. But I started to sense there was more for me. Like I just was like, man, I got to see God move even more. And at that point, I didn't believe in miracles, or like I didn't think that God wanted to heal people. So I still had that way of thinking. But there was something in my heart that was like, oh my gosh, there's got to be more. Like I've tasted a huge part of who God is, and there's got to be more. And so I went on a missions trip, actually a couple missions trips that went to Poland, which was like first time in my life seeing the gospel presented to people who hadn't known it before. And that was like, oh my gosh, like it was the first time being around evangelism and realizing there's people in the world that didn't know. That's not fully true, but people that like we could actually go as believers and share the gospel. I'd never seen that done before. So that was super eye-opening. And then I went to Mexico for a week. And that was super impactful. Just seeing the fruit, seeing we saw so many people get saved. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to come back here for a year. So then I moved to Mexico for a year. And it was during that year where I started watching Todd White videos. And for the first time in my life, I was like, oh my gosh, you can just like pray for the sick, and you can just share the gospel with people or get a word of knowledge for somebody, and they can be impacted by the love of God. And so I'm in Mexico working with kids a bunch, working at an orphanage, at the church, in the youth ministry, with children in soccer schools. So that year was just like exploring all these different areas of ministry. And at the same time, even in the church there, they didn't really go after miracles a whole lot, but that was something that I really wanted to experience and got really, really hungry for. And so it was the first time in Mexico. I was into Todd White videos, but I was so terrified to step out and pray for anybody because that was just way out of my comfort zone. And there was this moment where I was with some friends at their grandma's house, and she had been complaining about a toothache. And I didn't want to pray for her in front of anybody else because I was super nervous about stuff like that. But there was a moment where everybody had stepped outside for a second, and it was just me and this elderly grandma. And I was like, hey, can I pray for you in my broken Spanish? And I prayed for her super quick, and then stopped it as quickly as I could as well, because I didn't want anybody to see me doing that, because I was just way too nervous. And then at the end of the night, we watched a movie. And at the end of the night, the grandma's all excited, and she's talking in Spanish, and I didn't understand, but my friend translated, and she's like, you prayed for my grandma, and all the pain left, where she had all this pain before. And I was like, oh my goodness. There was just like this like light bulb moment of like, oh my gosh, I can see God touch people through me. So Mexico was this beautiful, beautiful journey of just starting to see what was the more that was available in God. Still had a lot of these religious mindsets and belief systems about who God was. And it's been a lifetime journey of healing and just being transformed by that. From that. And then I was coming to the end of my time, end of my year in Mexico. And I was like, God, what's next? Came across Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry. And I was like, that sounds really crazy, but really awesome. And I was watching some testimonies of people that had experienced that, and they had just so much freedom and joy and peace and life when I was just hearing them share their stories of how it impacted them. I was like, I have to do that. And so came back to Canada for 8 months, worked a job for a while, applied for school, and then basically right after Mexico, went to California and wound up being there for 3 years, and just learning about God and seeing him move and just being transformed in how I think and how I see him. One of the key ones was just realizing that God is for us. I think my whole life in religion, you have this belief system that God's always ready to just take things away from you that you're excited about or want or passionate about. So that was one of the key ones. There were so many, but God completely transformed the way I think about who he is and how I see him and interact with him as a father. And I'm trying to think of some key moments from Bethel. One of my favorites, honestly, was a trip that we did between first and second year. There's a bunch of my friends, and one of them had some contacts in Africa. I was like, hey, we're going to go to Africa for a couple of weeks, and we're just going to go minister. We're going to do a crusade. We're going to go to hospitals and schools and orphanages and just have fun as a bunch of friends and just see what God's going to do through us. And so I went on that trip, and this has been another of the defining moments of my life. But there was one morning, I was pretty tired, and so there was one morning where I actually decided, like, I'm not going to go do ministry with the team. They were going to a prison or something like that. And I'm like, I know, I'm just going to take the morning, I'm just going to chill, go to the market, and just kind of rest. And a friend of mine, he slept in and missed the bus. So he was annoyed about that. And I'm like, hey, let's just go to the market and hang out. Well, I'm sure there'll be people that we can pray for there, and we'll see what happens. It'll be a fun time. And so we got on one of these little motorbikes. There's 3 of us on there and ripping through the streets. It's awesome. You got to try it if you haven't done it. But we go to the market, and the African markets they are a sight to behold. There's just probably thousands of people, and they're just sprawling. It was just huge, and there's just one booth after the next of anything you can imagine, all kinds of foods and goods. So him and I are walking around and just kind of exploring, checking it out, chatting with some people. We prayed for one lady at a booth, and it was a neat little experience. I believe she felt loved and touched, and that was good. And then we saw a guy who was begging, and he had crutches with him that he was sitting on the ground. He had the crutches, and he had one, I think it was his left leg, was all bandaged up, and he obviously couldn't walk properly. And so we're like, hey, can we pray for you? And so he's sitting on the ground, and we start praying for him, for his leg, and he starts feeling like tingling and heat in that leg that's injured. And then he gets up and he starts like testing it out, and he's walking on it, and he's feeling like stuff is just shifting. There's just stuff, as we're praying, happening in his leg. And so he doesn't have at this point, he's walking without his crutches. He's walking slowly. He's all taped up still. But he's feeling something shift in his leg. And the people that were walking by are starting to stop and look at what's happening and seeing this guy get healed. And so it starts to turn into this little this little revival almost, and people just start approaching us and being like, hey, I have this problem. Can you pray for my knee, or can you pray for my shoulder? They bring us their babies, and like, can you pray for my baby? And then him and I are standing on the sidewalk, and there's maybe like 20 people, 25 people that are crowding in around us, and more people are kind of milling out and like kind of watching from a distance. And people are like leaning in, and anybody you made eye contact with immediately was like, hey, like I need you to pray for this. I need you to. They were just telling us what they wanted prayer for, like just super, super hungry. And so we're seeing people get healed. I believe that a tumor dissolved. This guy's leg got healed. There's just a whole bunch of things that happened in quick succession. And then we would just kind of stop and share the gospel. And then as I'm praying for people, this guy in front of me is like, hey, I have a brother and he's blind, but he's over here. Like, can you come over and pray for him? And my first thought was like, I don't pray for people that are blind. I don't, that's above my pay grade. And I just kind of ignored him. And just because there were so many other people that were needing prayer. So I'm just praying for these other people. Literally like anybody looked at is like trying to get your attention, and I'm just praying for people. They're getting touched. And then like 5 minutes later, he's gone and got his brother, and he's pushed him through the crowd, and now he's standing like literally like in front of me, like there's no breathing room because everybody's pushing in. And he's like, this is my brother, he's blind, pray for him. And he was like, just super matter of fact, like he's blind, you need to pray for him. And just beautiful faith, honestly, is what that was. So I'm like, well, I can't get out of this now. So I just like laying my hands on, I have my hands on his head. I just rebuke spirit of blindness in Jesus' name. And I'm like, I pray in tongues for a little bit, and I'm like, okay, now I'm not sure what to do. So I just had one hand on his head, and then with my other hand, I kept praying for people that were like pressing in around him. And then like a minute later, he didn't speak English, so the brother who's blind doesn't speak English, but his brother does. And then he just translates for me, and he's like, I can see you. So he's saying, I can see you. Like, so he's literally this far away from me. And he can't see me in one moment. And the next moment he's saying, I can see you. And I'm like, my mind just like broke. I was like, I don't even know what to do with this. And then then I was like kind of processing, okay, now what? And I had seen videos where people talk about when people get their eyesight restored, they would go and like, take him, like maybe put him 10 or 20 feet away and then hold up fingers and have them, have the previously blind person tell them how many fingers they're holding up. And so I was like, okay, let's try this. And so there's just way too many people that we couldn't do anything like that. So we walked a little bit further away, and just like in a bit more of an open space in the market area. And I'm holding up fingers, and the blind guy can tell me from 10, 15 feet away how many fingers I'm holding up. It was crazy. And people they had seen what was happening. So now they started like, so my buddy's over here on one sidewalk with a group of people around him. And when I went over with this blind guy who's just been healed, people started to gather around me. And so this goes on for like an hour, and just praying for people. Anybody that would come, we'd pray for them. We'd preach the gospel at different times. This blind guy can see. Moms are coming with their babies and like, hey, will you pray for my baby? And then time's kind of passing, and in my head, I'm like, we need to get back to the hotel because we have another event this afternoon. It was a crusade, actually. And I'm not quite sure how to get out of this because it's like literally everybody was hanging off you, wanting your attention. It was a wild experience. And then the security guard came over, and I was like, oh no, we must be in trouble because we're kind of causing a scene. But we needed to go anyways. And he's like, hey, you need to come with me. So he gets me, he gets my buddy, and he leads us out. And people are like literally like hanging on to us and being like, hey, no, like you need to pray for me. And he takes us across the parking lot into this like tiny little booth you can see there's lots of windows, and it's really small. And so the crowd had kind of followed us over to this little booth, and so he takes us inside, and then he closes the door, and he's like, I need to pray for us. Him and his colleague there. And then a third of their colleagues actually joined as well. So between the three of them, one got born again. I think they all three got healed of one thing or the other. And the one, I think, started praying in tongues or got delivered. It was just this wild. So it was about 10 minutes there with these three guys. And outside, the group is still mulling about and waiting for us to come back. And it was heart-wrenching because at that point we just had to go. So we kind of snuck out, and the security guard escorted us out so we could find a taxi and get back to our hotel. And so yeah, that was like really painful to walk away from, because there's so many hungry people. Like, will you come back? Like, when are you coming back? But that was one of another of the defining moments of my life. There had been this years-long process of just getting really hungry, of just being like, man, is this God real? And is the God I serve, does faith in him look like something? Is it tangible? Can I touch it? Can I taste it? Can I feel it? Does it change people's lives? And there was just this cry in my heart for so long of like, is this God that I grew up with? Is he real like that? And that was one of those moments where it was like a line in the sand of like, he's real and he changes people's lives, and faith in him looks like something more than going to church on Sunday and believing a certain way. Yeah, so that's really my story, or at least a part of it. Today, throughout that whole process, this heart has grown in me for just bringing justice for those that don't have a voice. So specifically for me, I have a heart for exploited kids. And so I want to use business and entrepreneurship as a tool to make an impact and to basically be a voice for exploited kids. So over the next decades, that's really one of the things that I want to focus on. And so that'll look like a lot of different things, but that's a big part of even like tying it back into my great-great-uncle Joe, the justice heart. Like I believe that runs in my family and is something that I want to carry on. And so, that's kind of where I'm at. And that's a big piece of how I've experienced God. And I'm excited for the future and all that I'm going to experience with him yet. So
if you could encourage people who are stuck in religion, what would you say to them?
If I could encourage people, entrenched in religion, I love that question. I would just first say, you are more loved by God than you could possibly imagine. Religion sets up all these structures and belief systems that create barriers between you and God. And for me, I just didn't know all of those belief systems and structures basically created this idea that I need to be perfect in order for God to love me and be accepted by him. So I would say, first of all, and right now where you are in the middle of your pain and your addictions, your messiness, your brokenness, like God sees you there, and he's a father on his knees waiting to hold you and embrace you. And if you'll be willing to, in the middle of your pain, just turn towards him, he'll love you and you'll experience his love. And that will start this beautiful process of transformation and a healing and a freedom. And I would just encourage you to keep stepping towards him, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's your own, when the fears of your own imperfection and mess are kind of just coming up, that are just telling you that he doesn't love you, that he doesn't see that you're not good enough. Like, you've got to lean it, you got to push through those and just know his embrace, because it's there, I promise you.
Micha, could you just pray for the viewers who feel stuck?
I'd love to. Yeah. So right now, wherever you are, God sees you. Yeah, and he knows you. And God, we just pray that you would meet each and every one of these individuals that know there's more, but maybe haven't experienced it. They've heard about it. They've read about it in the Bible. And there's this thing in their heart that's like, man, there's got to be more. But there's almost this fear of breaking out of the boxes and these religious ideas. I just pray that God would implant in you a hunger so fierce that it would compel you to just turn towards the Lord and walk towards him and just embrace whatever doors he opens for you as you go on this journey of just knowing and experiencing God. He has so many good things and so many beautiful moments and so much love for you. If you're willing to take a step towards him, he'll come running towards you. And so I just bless everyone who's feeling stuck, because that is not who you are. That's not what you're created for. And God has freedom for you. And I know that if he did it in my life, he can and he wants to do it in yours. So we just thank you for every one of these viewers. God, that you have so many good things for them, and that you will bless them and give them the courage and the hunger to move towards you. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, Micha.
Thank you, Sosa.